At 37 years old, Jacinda Ardern was the world's youngest female head of government when she became Prime Minister of New Zealand. She was also just the second in history to give birth while in office. And she led her nation of 5 million through multiple crises, including a devastating mass shooting and the COVID pandemic, before resigning in 2023. Her historic journey is the focus of a new documentary called Prime Minister, set to premiere next week. And I spoke with her recently about her time in office and her new memoir, A Different Kind of Power. Prime Minister Ardern, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So in the book, in the very first page, you dedicate it to the criers, the worriers, and the huggers, which just hit me right in the heart. But the words that you use to describe power are not words we usually hear from heads of state. You talk about empathy and kindness. You write about preparing to become prime minister and wanting to bring kindness back. How and why did those become your guiding principles?
Yeah, in part because I think those are all of the things that took me into politics in the first place. And I think, unfortunately, over time, and this is something that I notice is a bit of a universal theme, we've built up an expectation about the way that politicians need to behave in order to survive the political environment. But I don't believe that necessarily means that that is what people are expecting of us, that idea that you have to be devoid of kindness because that would equate to weakness, or the idea that it's a compassion-free zone. I actually do think voters seek that, and hopefully my time in politics demonstrated that you can lead in that way and you can successfully lead in that way.
You write in the book about very suddenly, somewhat unexpectedly being thrust into leadership, and you write very honestly about, I think, what's fair to call the imposter syndrome of it all. You wrote in the book, I'd been deputy leader for exactly 5 months. Now I was running to be the Prime Minister of New Zealand. There were moments where I hovered above myself, just an observer to these high-speed events. It all felt so surreal. So how do you get over that sense of, how did I get here and can I do this?
Responsibility. There is nothing, I think, that will overshadow any self-doubt more than a sense of responsibility. And I did, question at times whether I was the right person to be 7 weeks out from an election, suddenly at 37 years of age, being thrust into the position of running to be Prime Minister of New Zealand. But I think the message that I would like to share is, even if you have that confidence gap, first of all, you are able to overcome it when what becomes bigger in your mind is your sense of responsibility and your duty to others. But equally, that confidence gap can actually bring some strengths as well. It often means you bring humility to leadership. It means that you prepare. It often means you look for risk and that you bring in experts and others who can help inform your decision-making. Those are good leadership qualities that we too often discount.
You write about how you wanted to bring people into the experience of leadership, especially leading in crisis. And you had to do that, as you mentioned, when there was a white supremacist mass shooting at 2 mosques in New Zealand, killed 51 people in 2019. And we should remind people, gun ownership in New Zealand is relatively high,
It
right?
is.
Guns, in this case, in that shooting, had been legally acquired.
Yes.
You said never again. You push for change, and you do it. You ban military-style semi-automatic weapons, you limit high-capacity magazines, establish a firearms registry, all within just over a year. And I know that you're hesitant to weigh into other nations' politics, especially here in the U.S., but you live here now. You know both these countries. So I wonder what you think the difference is between the two nations that kept similar changes from being enforced here.
And look, I comment as an observer and also acknowledging the significant differences in our political systems. Yes, we changed our gun laws and the ban on military-style semi-automatic weapons after that horrific event in New Zealand. Those laws changed within 27 days. But that was also because we had the support of members of parliament. We have 120 of them and 119 voted in favour of that change. And I think it's because they felt the weight of expectation from the New Zealand public. Because an empathetic response is nothing if it's not coupled with action that doesn't, drive change. And my observation, of course, is that our systems are different, but also in New Zealand we do see gun ownership as very much a responsibility versus a right. But having said that, still observe, an expectation as well here.
Among the general public?
Yeah, among the general public. I do sense that. I think merely the fact that I'm asked so frequently about that change in New Zealand, that I'm asked to make an observation on here, that tells me that that crisis is still calling for change. It just has not yet been answered yet.
Do you feel lawmakers here have failed to meet the expectations then?
Again, this is where, I just, again, as an outside observer, only lawmakers could speak to the circumstances that are leading to the status quo. My observation, though, is of the public is that the expectation for change is still present.
You write very personally in the book, too, about all the questions that you, as a woman in her mid-30s, as a woman who talked about wanting a family, face all along your political career as you rose into power. You were, whether or not you were planning on getting pregnant, whether or not you would take maternity leave if elected. One interviewer asking about, shouldn't employers know who they're hiring? And that's a moment you write about on a TV show in which you kind of snap. And you point at him and you say, it is totally unacceptable in 2017, when this interview was, to say that a woman should have to answer that question in a workplace. You repeated, it is unacceptable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me about that moment. What happened?
Yeah, there'd been a bit of, there had been some, as you say, some context to that, some build-up. I had perhaps climatised to the idea that it was something that for me was not going to be personal. And in part, I accepted that. I was in public life. I was in a role where I was asking for people to support me. So I guess in a way I put myself in a different category when it came to questions around having a family. So I was used to the speculation and I was happy to answer that question, but I completely rebelled against the idea that every woman should have to answer that question. And so that was a moment where I pushed back hard, not for me, but I hoped in that moment for others.
You've become very familiar with this country in a bit more ways. In the headlines today is this very public, very personal back and forth between two of the most powerful men on the planet, President Trump and Elon Musk. And I just wonder, as you watch this unfold in the way that it is, very shoot from the hip, very emotional, what do you make of that? How are you watching that?
Yeah, one of the things that I hope to do by putting out a book that I never really intended to write was to spotlight different types of leadership. Because actually, regardless of whether you start a conversation about politics in the US or in parts of Europe, we are in a moment where a particular style of leadership is being spotlighted, but it's not the only one. I lead a fellowship on empathetic leadership with politicians who are out there in the field now, often in senior positions, who are leading in a very particular way, but that often doesn't attract headlines. So I'll use whatever opportunity I have to put the spotlight on them instead.
Could you ever see two women having this kind of public back and forth in leadership positions? Is there a double standard that's still
Maybe
at
we
play?
put a few more women in leadership and then we can ask ourselves the question.
Do you think the U.S. will have a woman president in her lifetime?
In my lifetime, I do believe. Yes, I do.
Why do you
I
believe that?
And I don't think I'm particularly engaging in anything that would give me any outstanding longevity. So why do I think that? I think all, Western liberal democracies are designed to represent the communities they serve. And I'm very lucky. In New Zealand, the first country in the world to give women the right to vote, I was the third female prime minister. There does come a point where gender doesn't become an issue anymore and it just becomes about good leadership.
The book is a different kind of power. The author is the Right Honourable Dame and former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. Prime Minister, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.